Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on 6 ways to be a more engaging speaker. We've all been in a seminar room where the speaker or the trainer has not connected with their audience. Now, there may be various reasons why they weren't able to connect. One of the things is death by PowerPoint. One of the things is just lecturing and ramming too much information down your throat. Regardless of the reason, my aim in today's 30-minute webinar is to give you some ways to be more engaging as a speaker. And you can choose from your own style, your own experience, what are you going to use as your palette of techniques, of strategies, just to make you a little bit more engaging. So Peter Dew's my name. Most of you know me. Welcome, Michael, and welcome, Peter. We're just getting underway. So Peter Dew's my name. I'm a public speaking trainer and coach, and I speak at conferences, and I'm a person who stutters. So my journey to public speaking comes from one of fear, of difficulty, and of avoidance. So I'm not a natural public speaker. I'm not a gifted natural speaker. What I do in my workshops, in my presentations, comes from hard work and from learning the skills. And I want to share some of that knowledge with you guys in the half hour we have together. For those of you who haven't participated before, this is just my standard request. Ask questions as we go. I will stop and say, are there any questions? But don't wait for me to say that. Type in a comment, type in a remark at any stage. Take notes, participate through comments, through remarks, and think about the content. The best way to think about the content is to ask yourself, how can I use this in my life, in my next training workshop, in my next seminar I run. I've just got a pop-up that says the network is not very good, so I'm going to turn off my webcam and just in the hope that you can hear me better. So you're not going to see me anymore. So apply and think of the content to your own personal situation. What might you do differently? What have you done in the past that you realize lost some engagement? And if there's additional questions after today, send me an email and I will also make this webinar available via recording. So the 6 things that I'm going to talk about, and there are other ways of engaging audiences, but use your storytelling, use a bit of humor, involve the audience, be conversational, have some activities for them to do, and the powerful thing to ask the audience questions. So let me go through those one by one. Tell your stories. The stories that you use will determine how well you engage and how influential you are in terms of getting your message across to your audience. So I love this quote. People don't remember what you said. They remember how you made them feel. So therefore, your journey is to take them on a little bit of an emotional roller coaster. And the way we can do this is via storytelling, struggles, challenges, successes, attempting to do things and having failures, but the lessons that come from the failures. So storytelling is an art, but it is something that leaders, speakers, trainers need to incorporate more into their presentation style. If you don't tell stories, then people may not remember what you said. Now, I've just realized that your slide may not have moved forward. So let me try this again. It would appear that the connection is not very good today. And I'm not sure the reason, but I cannot even see that you're seeing any of my screens. Can you hear me still? Internet connection very slow today. I am on the NBN, and that says something about the NBN. So tell your stories. Tell your stories. The reason we tell stories is because if you tell people some facts, some information, some data, some statistics, then there's about a 10% retention rate. So 1 in 10 will remember what you've said. If you add a visual image, so you do a PowerPoint slide, you do a handout, you do a flip chart, you bring out a prop to demonstrate, then you've tripled your retention rate to 30%. If you tell a story with examples and it's engaging and it takes people on that emotional ride, then you've increased your retention rate to 70%, 75%. That's why we tell stories. So part of your engagement, part of getting audiences engaged is to tell a story. Now, I pick different stories for different audiences. When I work with finance, banking, I tell a story about someone dying without a will and the problems that caused a particular person. When I'm working with the mining sector, it's more technical stories. When I work with health department, with health professionals, and within human services, the stories are more about people's struggles. So you choose the stories for the right people. Become proficient at storytelling. And that's one of the key things that I teach within my workshops, within my presentation skills workshops, the art and the craft of telling a story. But this is the science behind why we tell stories. Use humor. Now, you don't have to be a stand-up comedian to use humor. You can bring out some props. You can use some unusual data or statistics. You can ask the audience to do something, and the audience can be the source of the humor. With my presentation skills, overcome your fear of public speaking, I often get people to go around and share why they're in the workshop and what's one of the worst situations they've found themselves at within a public speaking perspective in terms of hindsight. In hindsight, what happened and what was bad about it. Now, this is not to laugh at anyone, but people often, when they tell what happened, they laugh themselves. And it wouldn't have been funny at the time, I can assure you, but their laughter then brings laughter within the room. So self-deprecating humor is the right humor to use. But if you can get the audience to be the source of the humor, ask them to share a time when things didn't work out, and there'll often be humor in what's shared. So you do not have to be a stand-up comedian to be a funny speaker or facilitator. I love this quote from John Cleese. If you can get your audience to laugh at you, then they'll like you better, which makes you more open to my ideas. And if I can persuade you to laugh at the particular point that I'm making, by laughing at that point, you're acknowledging its truth. So basically, if you say something that has a point and it's couched within humour and the audience laughs, they're endorsing your point, according to John Cleese. Are there any questions on use of humour? Thanks, Steve. Yes, I have seen humour used badly as well. Wrong joke for the wrong audience. And be careful. I always like to do a cultural audit, gender, age, usually some Aboriginality within my room, and what is funny to one group of people may not be funny to another group of people. And as I said, the self-deprecating humour, so sharing a journey that you've been on to illustrate a point, and in hindsight, at the time it wasn't very funny. So yeah, be careful with your humour. One thing you can do is test it out. Test it out with colleagues, with friends, with family before you take it to the live stage. And another thing that comedians have is, what is your recovery? What's your strategy for recovering when a joke does not go well? And there's several ways, and that is to move straight on to a strong point that kind of highlights and amplifies what you're saying, and therefore the humour is left behind. Another strategy is to acknowledge it, and some comedians say, well, that didn't work the way I meant it to work, but they just leave it and then they move on. The worst thing is to react yourself as a speaker and kind of die as your humour doesn't have the impact you wanted. You need to move on to the next point confidently and effectively. So thanks for that question. Involve your audience. Get them to do something. I went and saw Bohemian and Rhapsody, the movie about Queen, last weekend, and the song that they use, We Will Rock You, they designed it specifically to involve the audience. So it's one of those songs where you stomp your feet and clap your hands for the first part of the song before they move in to the musical, and it gets the whole Wembley crowd involved, engaged. Yes, they're a great rock band and Freddie Mercury had a great voice, but this particular song was very engaging and at the time quite innovative. So what are you going to do to involve your audience? Are you going to get them to solve a problem? Are you going to make them part of the story? One of the things with storytelling is to turn the mirror on the audience. How would have you handled that situation? What would have you done? What could have I done differently? So that's involving the audience. Pose a problem. Get them to solve the problem. Get them to work in teams. Set a project, some team building exercises. I've been in one workshop where each table of 5 people had some blocks, a random bag of blocks, and the goal was to complete a particular tower. Oh, and in that bag of blocks was a plan for this tower. So think of Lego blocks, and each table had a different plan they had to build. Now in the entire room there was just sufficient blocks to complete each tower. And the rule was you had to negotiate and trade with the blocks you needed and that those were missing. But the aim of the exercise was to complete all the towers. But there was a competition at each table, so people wouldn't trade and were very reluctant, very cagey. And the time to build all the towers was about 35 minutes. But a group of school kids, they were able to do it in 6 minutes. And what they did was the whole room worked as a team. and they built one tower, put all the blocks in the middle, built one tower, moved on, built the next tower, and built the third, the fourth, and the fifth, and all towers were completed within 5 minutes. So what activity can you do to involve the audience? Just a point from Sarah. Yeah, there are activities that are just time-wasting activities. Thanks, Sarah. That raises another issue as well. One of the ways we can start with a workshop is what's called an icebreaker. Now, let's all line up and find out who's travelled the furthest distance. And you come from 5 kilometres away, and you come from Bunbury 200 kilometres, and we'll line them up. The icebreaker that has no point really doesn't help engage. The activity that isn't related, and then when you deconstruct the activity, has the deep learning, is not the right activity. So doing something for the sake of doing it, and maybe even doing some team building. But if your workshop's not about team building, you want to build teams at the table first before you go on to talking about strategic planning, and team building was really just to get familiar with each other. You may lose engagement because some people want to just move on to what they're there for. So both with your activities and both with any icebreakers you do, to build engagement, make sure they relate, that they link back to your core message or your core purpose of that seminar. All right. So one of the ways of involving your audience is what I call tell, show, ask, share. And if you kind of run this every 10 minutes, it's a great way of keeping them engaged. So you start off by telling them some information, some data, it could be story. Then you need to show them your PowerPoint, or you do a handout. Bearing in mind, some people are auditory listeners, some people are visual learners, and the others are kinesthetic. So remember in my introductory slide, I said, now apply this to yourself. Ask yourself, how would you use this in a future presentation? Is there anything you've done in a previous presentation that you now recognize you could have done to be more engaging? So you can ask them to think, apply, consider, how would this work in your life? How would this work in your business? And finally, you can share. Would anyone like to share what they discussed with their partner? Or would anyone like to share their thoughts? Or if it's a big conference and you can't open it up, share to the person next to you. What's one thing you've learnt so far? What's your key takeaway? Tell, show, ask, share is a great way of keeping your audience engaged. And you can structure that as a way of involving the audience, and you can have 3 or 4 of them that you can roll out whenever. So you do some content, then move into your tell, show, ask, share. All right, moving on. Be conversational. This is really quite simple, but I still see people that lecture, that just tell people how to suck eggs. This is the 4-step process. Audiences want to have a conversation with the speaker or the trainer. And even the really large audiences, each individual member wants to walk out of that audience feeling like Peter has just had a chat with you. So while I've got about 25 on this webinar, I want all of you to feel like I'm speaking with you. I read out some names earlier on. I've asked for comments as we go. I'm asking you to think, how might you use this in your particular life, in your circumstances? Are you conversational, or are you very direct and do kind of a lecture? People learn better when adults have conversations with them. So even on the podium with 150 people, be conversational. And part of being conversational is it makes you look authentic and it makes you look genuine. Are there any questions on that? How do you be conversational when you read from your notes? Yeah, thanks, David. Look, different webinar. Don't read from your notes. Know your content so well that you don't need to read notes. By using storytelling effectively, you can remember your information by telling the stories, and the points, the key points, the key learnings are within the stories. Feel free to send me an email. Anyone can send me an email. I'm sure I've got a webinar recording somewhere on how to speak, how to present without notes. But yeah, that's, if you want to be conversational, it's really hard to be conversational as you're reading from a script. So good point. Have some activities for them to do. A little bit of this was around involving them. What kind of activities? The blocks, the taking notes, the solve a problem. I was in a workshop the other day where we did some origami, some paper folding, and we did that thing where you put your fingers in and you can open it up, and we wrote the key learnings in each one, and we'd just kind of move it and find one key learning, and then we had to talk about it to the people in the table. But we had to get walked through that step of making that paper folding. Millennials, Gen X's, Gen Y's, you can involve them by using their mobile devices. You can do a poll. You can do a challenge and get them to vote live on mobile phone. There's some apps that you put up on the screen and you give them a phone number and everyone dials in, then you ask questions and they answer the questions in real time. Using their mobile devices really does engage millennials. So just another option for some of the activities. It can be online activities done via mobile phone nowadays. So a wide range of options for engaging people with online activities. One of the things I do, when I'm doing the big keynote presentations, one of my slides is gettalk.com, and I put all my slides and some extra free resources up on the website, and it's just a tiny link, a tiny URL, gettalk.com, Peter Dew, and they can take a photo of that with their phone, and then when they go and log in, they get my PowerPoint slides, they get my handouts, they get some free resources, some reports I've written, maybe an ebook. So I'm adding a lot of value, but I'm also capturing their email, and I realize that this is someone who's interested in what I've just done. Lots of ways of, lots of activities and ways you can engage people. Get them to ask questions. Remember the tell, show, ask, share? Well, just questioning alone will set people's concentration spans. And it doesn't have to be a Q&A like I might do now. Does anyone else have any questions? It can be a rhetorical question. Just imagine if this was you. What are some of the strategies that you would do to get out of this situation? But a Q&A session can really engage the audiences. And what I often do with Q&A is I save it for particular parts within the presentation. And those presentations where I know I've got people in a more emotional state, and I've just shared a story that they thought was really very powerful. And an example of the story is the first time that I spoke. An example of such a story is the first time that I stood up and spoke to a group of people was age 41 when I delivered my father's eulogy. So the first time I did any public speaking was not at school, was not in my workplace, was actually delivering my father's eulogy. And it was one of those amazing tipping points in my life. where I got self-belief for the first time. And then I'll ask people, does anyone have any questions about this? And I'll also say there's no questions that are off limits. Any questions you want to know about overcoming my fear, my journey, the role my father played in helping me believe in myself. So questions, a great way to engage the audience. You need to manage your Q&A. Remember, I've said I'll do questions during. I don't end with questions, by the way. So this is the end of my presentation. Are there any questions? Because you lose control of your Q&A. I like to ask questions about a particular, within my workshop, around a particular area that I've just spoken about. And if someone asks a question outside of scope or that I haven't covered, I will park that question and say, look, let's deal with that later on in the webinar. Let's deal with that later on in the seminar. I'm going to pause for a moment. Are there any questions? What do you do if the MC takes questions, says you have to have questions at the end? Yeah, that's a common question I get. What do you do if the MC says you'll speak for 20 minutes, then we'll have 10 minutes of Q&A? When we agree to speak, when we get asked to speak, it's important to understand it's our gig, it's our presentation. So I will tell the MC, look, I'd rather do it this way. I will speak for 15 minutes. I'll take 10 minutes for question and answer, and then you give the floor back to me and give me 5 minutes to wrap up. The reason is if the question and answer is difficult or left field and you end with that question, that becomes your accidental take-home message. The last question can hijack your core message. It can take your audience down the wrong path. So I deal with my Q&A. No more questions? Good. Now I come back and I wrap up. So thanks for all those questions we've had during the webinar. So in summary and wrapping up, lots of ways to engage your audience. These are some that I like to use. I tell stories. I try and use humour where I can. I am not a stand-up comedian. Involve the audience. Get them involved. Be conversational. Don't lecture. Have some activities for them to do and get them to ask questions. Next webinars will be coming up. Workshops starting off in January in Perth, going up to Karratha in February. You'll always find those on my website. Next webinars, public speaking etiquette, 6 common mistakes that speakers make. And this is from observation, and it's to do with going over time. You'll notice I've got about 2 minutes to wrap up. I don't go over time. It's about people not using microphones. It's about people being disrespectful to their audience. So what are common mistakes that speakers do? How to build credibility. So you're speaking on a topic, but what gives you the right, the credibility to ask people to follow you, to believe you, to come on a journey with you? So those are the next webinars, one more in December and one in January. Send me an email if you have any further questions, and I will end the webinar there.